Then I want to welcome all of you which are following this event through Facebook. My name is Gunnar Eklöver-Slydal, and I'm honored to share this event. And I'm very grateful that such prominent people have accepted to speak. Also thanks to the permanent representation of Lithuania to the OSCE, which we have cooperated with in arranging the event and making it known to parliamentarians and delegations. Also thank you to Ms. Vilja Aleknaite, member of the Lithuanian Parliament and head of the Lithuanian delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and to Mr. Åsmund Aukrust, Norwegian member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who will both speak during the event. We originally planned the event as a side event during the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly winter meeting. However, as everything these days are taking place in a virtual space, we had to make some changes. We invited members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and delegations in Vienna, but also opened the event up for a wider public to follow. And this is very fitting because the topic of the event concerns all of us. How to counter impunity for the serious human rights crimes taking place in the ongoing repression of political opposition, media, civil society, and the wider public who wants a democratic Belarus and a democratic Russia. We will have two panels, which I will introduce later, the first on Belarus and the second on Russia. But before that, I'm now very happy to give the virtual floor to Ms. Vilja Aleknaite, head of the Lithuanian delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who will give an introductory speech. Please, Vilja.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon for everybody, for all distinguished participants of this important meeting. At the outset, please allow me to cordially thank Norwegian Helsinki Committee for organizing this event and for inviting me to say some words. Every day we experience how much the pandemic has complicated our lives. But what makes us not less worried that a pandemic of authoritarianism is in progression in the OSCE area. And sadly, we Lithuanians see it in our close neighborhood. Last August, we saw wonderful people demonstrating in Belarus. They marched in huge numbers on the streets of their cities, smiling, singing, and waving their flags. They were so peaceful that they would jump out of their shoes before stepping on a street bench. One could be jealous of Lithuanians to have such attentive people living next to us. But at the same time, we saw extreme brutality of the Belarusian police hit squad. It's a tragedy when law enforcement agencies turn into repression enforcement tools. And how could it happen that government is so sharply different from its peaceful nation? In any case, this cannot be the government of the people's choice. The widespread violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, torture, inhuman treatment of peaceful protesters, persecution of human rights defenders and journalists, politically motivated imprisonments and other mistreatment committed by the authorities in Belarus and in Russia are evident. In both countries, the mentioned violations are increasing and becoming more and more brutal. For example, poisoning and imprisonment of Mr. Alexei Navalny and the following arrests of many thousands. However, what is even more disturbing, nobody in these countries ever was held accountable for these crimes. The long-term systemic impunity for such repressions without a timely and effective response would become a new normality. And do we, the OSCE community, have enough potential of disagreement with systemic violations of the fundamental principles we all agreed upon. So the application of concrete international instruments is of primary importance. Let me recall the reports of human rights violations. They were prepared by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and under the OSCE Moscow mechanism. These reports presented a number of recommendations to international community, to OSCE institutions and other actors, as well as to the two countries concerned, Belarus and Russia. Regretfully, neither Russia nor Belarus are not showing any willingness with regard to implementation of these recommendations. A few weeks ago, the ministers of foreign affairs of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, in their letter to the heads of the OSCE and the Council of Europe, invited to engage all possible tools of these organizations and respond accordingly to the recent events in Russia and arrest of Alexei Navalny. Fighting impunity is possible only by taking concrete and principled actions, including, first of all, international or national sanctions, targeted ad hoc sanctions lists. Second, adoption and application of Magnitsky Acts. Let me also remind that Lithuania was the third country in the world and the first country in Europe to adopt such legislation. And I'm very pleased to see Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza and Mr. Bill Broder working with this issue at our today's event. Third, promotion of universal criminal jurisdiction. And Mr. Dobrovolsky, I hope, who is working with this topic also in Vilnius, will bring new insights. The European Court of Human Rights has already found in its judgments that the detention of Navalny is arbitrary and politically motivated. The recent European Union's decision on further sanctions against Russian officials over the imprisonment of Navalny and the application of the recently established European Union human rights sanctions regime is a big step forward, and we hope that it will be implemented. The activation of the accountability instruments at the disposal of other international organizations or creation of an independent mechanism responsible for the collection, analysis, and preservation of evidence for the judiciary purposes could serve as supporting means. All these measures complement each other and, if applied in combination, may bring a positive effect in such hostile contexts. They, of course, will not change regimes overnight, but shall send them a clear message. We have entered the third decade of the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. We are using smartest technologies like people never did before. And at the same time, on European soil, innocent people are threatened, beaten, tortured in prisons and on the streets, and even killed. It seems that we are going back to the darkest years of the totalitarianism. It must be stopped by all means. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vilija Aleknaite, for your thorough description of the possible measures. I think you covered the most important ones, and I'm sure we will hear more about it. And we are very thankful to your leadership on this. And I now will introduce the panel on Belarus, which will further enlighten our discussion about what we can do. Because we all know that after Lukashenko lost as we believe, the 9th August 2020 presidential elections, the opposition has gained increasing international recognition as a legitimate representative of the Belarusian people. However, rather than engaging in dialogue with the opposition on democratic transition, authorities engaged in heavy-handed repression, imprisoning and abusing thousands of members of the country's democracy movement, as well as peaceful protesters and those supporting them, human rights defenders, journalists, and other actors. To help us understand this situation better and to suggest how European institutions and the wider international community can help the victims of repression, including by countering impunity, we have gathered a prominent panel. I will introduce them and then give them a chance to speak afterwards. First of all, we invited and had a positive response from Mrs. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, the presidential candidate for the opposition. She was probably the candidate who got the most votes. If there had been a fair election, she would have won. And she has remained leader of the democracy movement in the country afterwards. At her side, her senior political advisor, Mr. Franak Vychoshka. He has a background as a journalist and has been heavily involved in providing independent reporting and news services in Belarus. Then I also want to introduce my colleague, Berit Lindemann, is head of our Eastern Europe and Central Asia section. She has long-term experience in working with human rights groups in this part of the world and have led many of the organizations monitoring and civil society support projects. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Alexander Dobrovolsky, which is a member of the Coordination Council of Belarus. And he has an impressive background as a politician and campaigner for democratic governance, even dating back to Soviet times, as I understand. So now I give the virtual floor to you, Mrs. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, please.
Dear members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I would like first of all to thank you for keeping Belarus at the top of your agenda. And yesterday in Belarus, we marked the 200th day of the peaceful protest. And till now, our demands remain the same as previously: free and fair elections, immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners, and holding accountable those responsible for the grave human rights violations and election fraud. And while Minister McKay claims at the UN Human Rights Council that there is no need to pay close attention to Belarus' human rights situation, there are 250 recognized political prisoners in Belarus. Only last week, the court handed down an unprecedented 2-year sentence to the brave female journalists Daria Chultsova and Katerina Andreeva. Lukashenko's regime punished Daria and Katerina for just doing their job. And the court hearing continues in the case of journalists Katerina Borisevich and Dr. Artem Sorokin. Two innocent people decided to tell the truth about the murder of the peaceful protester Roman Bondarenko. The court hearing against the former presidential hopeful Viktor Babarika has started. And my husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky, is charged with organizing mass protests, but his guilt is telling the truth and running for president. And, you know, his 2 children and I haven't seen him for 9 months already. And there are about 900 suspects in politically motivated criminal cases at the moment. Hundreds of people show up in front of the courts to show solidarity with these people. And we need to make sure that they are free as soon as possible and that the national dialogue is finally launched. And we have a strategy. Since election day, our movement has grown and matured. gathering all the democratic forces and building up our alliances. And we are working with all society, from sports people to journalists, from workers to teachers, from business people to former civil servants. On our side, we have Belarusian people who have shown their great spirit in the fight of their freedom. They self-organize and coordinate in local communities. On our side, we have our international friends and partners. We gathered reliable international support from global leaders and the Belarusian diaspora all over the world. On our side, we have recognized experts in the field who provide their expertise pro bono to continue to our common cause of freedom in Belarus. And on our side, we have a peaceful protest that can only lead to peaceful dialogue. And on our side, we have the truth that Belarusian people won't change and do not support the status quo. They stood up against violence and lies and will not back off. And now we are preparing for the Belarusian spring. The coming months will be crucial for us, and we need to be at the negotiation table by May. And your effort to promote dialogue with all stakeholders in the country is precious for Belarus people. I call on you to use all possible tools of interparliamentary diplomacy to contribute to the national dialogue and finding the solutions for the current crisis in Belarus. And the work of OSCE Parliament Assembly Special Representative is crucial in this respect, and we will support Ms. Derrida's efforts. And OSCE is a very important organization for Belarus since we are a full member, and this forum could become a dedicated platform for dialogue. And the recommendations and roadmap for starting the OSCE Moscow Mechanism reports dialogue should be followed up and duly implemented. And the OSCE can also work together with the Council of Europe, the United Nations, the European Union, and the US to find common ground for the meditation towards a peaceful transition in Belarus. And Belarusian people deserve democracy and freedom. They deserve a peaceful transition of power through dialogue. So let us work together towards this goal. And I call on you to stand with Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'm not sure whether Franok Wiatrowska, do you want to add something to this?
I can just add that we are grateful to international community and to OSCE, and of course Norwegian Helsinki Committee for many years supported Belarus. So at this moment we have several challenges that Belarusian society is facing. On one hand, we have a dictatorial regime, which is militarizing very quickly and brings insecurity to the whole region. We see and hear threats by Lukashenko that he's going to use weapons, firearms, that he's preparing for the spring protest. And at the same time, we see the willingness of people to continue their struggle in the peaceful, non-violent form. And I think that will be the huge challenge in the next 1 or 2 months to keep the protest peaceful and to avoid violence. And in our opinion of Officer Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, we should stick with our principles that we put in the very beginning in this protest to keep it non-violent. But with the help of international community, international attention, international organizations such as OSCE and United Nations, to raise awareness and to raise the cost of potential use of violence by the regime. In case if this attention will be low and not enough, there is a high chance that Lukashenko will be increasing pressure on the people, will increase number of arrests and repressions on civil society representatives and those who will participate in rallies. We also continue working on building platform or channels of negotiations This is very difficult because we are dealing with a regime which puts its power as the highest priority. We are dealing with a regime led by the person who doesn't want to give up, and who never had experience of making deals with counterparts mutually beneficial. This is why we are seeking for OSCE mediation, help, and support. We are also approaching different governments such as Austria, Germany, Finland, France, Ukraine, in order to help us to initiate such dialogue. In order to make this dialogue efficient, we need to build it on the principles of mutual respect. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya has participated, thanks to Roberto Montello from Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, in several rounds of negotiations with Lukashenko's representatives, Andrei Savinych, who represents Lukashenko's parliament. But unfortunately, this ended, and it didn't lead to any concrete solutions. We also see that all people who support the movement, even not politically involved, they are targets for Lukashenko's regime. Especially we are speaking now about workers. We never saw before in Belarus history such attack and crackdown on workers' movement, on trade unions, striking committees, other workers' initiatives. Many of them went on strikes on October and still in strikes. And they don't receive salary. They are constantly threatened by authorities, by their administration. And here, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya's team is working on helping them on one hand, these workers who are under repression, but also working with the companies that collaborate with Belarusian partners and can condition their collaboration by stopping repressions against workers. Here I speak about Yara International, the Norwegian company, the potash producer, the potash products producer, who are working with Belarus Kali, and their strong active involvement helped at some point to decrease level of repression against workers. But we ask here all governments and human rights organizations, international organizations, to engage new actors and to find new solutions, because Belarus situation is non-conventional and it needs non-conventional solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Mrs. Berit Lindemann, and I think we will hear more about the involvement of civil society in this struggle and how we as outsiders can help and also support our colleagues inside the country. If you want to ask questions, you can use the comments section, and then we will pick up questions and ask them to the panelists. Please, Berit, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Have I unmuted? Yes. Yeah, there is no need to repeat any statistics or information to underline the urgency of the situation in Belarus. And the result of the impunity for those grave violations is more violence and new crimes. For us who have been involved with Belarus for many years, we remember the cases of disappearances 20 years ago, thoroughly investigated, but never solved, and nobody have ever been brought to justice. So this impunity leads to more of the human rights violations. The report of the OSCE Moscow mechanism is the most authoritative and thorough documentations of what has been gone on the last 6 months, and have excellent recommendations. And now the time is to follow up. And one of the important recommendations is also to end this impunity. On the basis of accountability is always thorough documentations of facts and a thorough investigation. Documentation has already been underway for a long time by Belarusian NGOs, and they need our support. International efforts to support is underway. There is an international accountability platform for Belarus being established right now, led by a Danish NGO called Dignity. Maybe we can come back more to this during the discussion, because it is an important groundwork for the accountability that needs to come. The principle of accountability requires that perpetrators of human rights violations and international crimes must be brought to justice. And given that Belarus will hardly do this, it is up to the international community to act. We believe there are options at hand that must be used more. And here states, who you keep demanding accountability in Belarus, you can also do better. There are two main avenues which can be used. It is the International Criminal Court, and it is the measure of universal jurisdiction. As you all know, Belarus has not ratified the Rome Treaty, and ICC has no direct jurisdiction to Belarus, but jurisdiction can still be assumed. As part of the crimes take place on the territory of state parties, for instance, Belarusian neighboring countries, these states can ask for state referral. The reference to this action is Rome Statute Article 12.2. On this basis, ICC may exercise jurisdiction over Belarusian authorities responsible for the forced displacement of activists out of the country. Now, this has been used for Rohingyas being forced to Bangladesh, a state party, from Myanmar, a non-state party. It's a good avenue because it is efficient. It is, you don't need to have very time-consuming preliminary investigations for the use of this. The Brussels-based NGO International Partnership for Human Rights has engaged for states to pursue this avenue, first of all in Lithuania, and they have received many displaced Belarusians, and more states should do this, and it can also support a possible effort from Lithuania, a hopeful effort by Lithuania. And I think the argument used by states that procedures may be difficult or complicated should not stop states, because legal practice, as any lawyer would know, is in fact dynamic, and such cases can set a very, very important precedent for future incidents or situations of grave crimes. Without the state referral, ICC could as well be urged to investigate on its own initiative. That it follows the Rome Statute of Article 15. This is much more time consuming though. And the second main direction is to build universal jurisdiction cases in different European countries. I mean, you need to have this mechanism in the national justice system, but an increasing number of states have this. Another condition is that victims of human rights crimes have fled to these countries. But given the situation we have with Belarusians now fleeing Belarus to many different countries, there are also many different countries who could use it. So we can only say use it, and we can also say fund it, because these mechanisms are often very badly resourced in many states. So sanctions, I will not go into sanctions because it is a non-judicial measure and it doesn't replace criminal prosecution, but we do think they are efficient. Belarus has been under sanction on and off for many years. More sanctions are now underway and more is needed. Again, on the basis of this, the documentation done by Belarusian NGOs and international human rights community of these individual cases is absolutely key. I think, as I mentioned, sanctions have worked in Belarus, and maybe they only have been lifted too soon. We shouldn't lift them before they're actually seen changes in Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berit, with clear challenges to states and parliamentarians following this event. And I'm sure if there is a need to know more about, for instance, the ICC approach, we can provide more insight and information. So please be in contact with the Norwegian Helsinki Committee about that. Our final speaker in this panel is Alexander Dobrovolsky. I think you will also speak about universal jurisdiction. Please, the virtual floor is yours. You are muted, so you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you're right. I will speak about universal jurisdiction. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for organizing this discussion. It's very important for us, and it's very important for people from Belarus who are now victims of tortures and terror. As we see, citizens of Belarus cannot find justice in their own country. So we are trying to help them to find justice abroad. And we have an experience of Lithuania. There are already 7 persons who were recognized as witnesses and victims of tortures and terror in Belarus. And the investigation by Lithuanian criminal police is going on. In near future, we think that dozens of new victims of tortures will come to criminal police, and it's a good example that it's possible to find solutions to help people to find justice. We think that it's not so easy, but in future, many militiamen from Belarus will find themselves in a list of Interpol, and it may be a very important factor for them to stop and to help them to understand that impunity is no longer guaranteed for them. I think that the idea of Lithuanian government to create such an international coalition for implementing of universal jurisdiction principles, it may be very fruitful for that. And we know that there are negotiations between Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and maybe some other countries. And we count on a new body named Justice Hub that is going to be founded in Vilnius, Lithuania, very soon, as a coordination body for this activity. It may be very important to share the experience and to make more intensive work in this direction. We think that implementing of Moscow mechanism may be very important, as well as international investigations. We know that using mechanism of international criminal court is a problem, but we hope that this problem may be solved using the experience of Myanmar or Syria. But the only working mechanism now is universal jurisdiction in Lithuania and possibly other countries, as Poland, Czech Republic, Latvia, and we hope that it will work. As my colleague Franak said, we count on OSCE and its role as a mediator to organize the negotiations between Belarusian authorities and protesters to overcome our political crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspectives. I want to give some questions. We already received some questions from the audience also, which I will refer to. Speaking about the role of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, I want to ask you, and the question goes primarily to Sviatlana and maybe Franak. Do you assess that you get enough support from other European countries than your neighbor? I think Lithuania is maybe the country who supports the democracy movement in Belarus the most. So the question is whether there are more things that other countries also could do to step up their support. And in line with what both Berit and Alexander referred to, the need for states to support documentation and accountability mechanisms, both exercising universal jurisdiction. I guess this is something that the Parliamentary Assembly could ask states to do. So I just want to have your take on whether you feel that this is happening now, or is there a need for more support?
I can start here regarding the support from outside. Help by Lithuania, Poland is enormous. So basically, the first days after August 9, Lithuania hosted Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya and family and many activists. Poland provided a safe space for thousands of people, journalists, activists coming from Belarus and still helping. Ukraine is hosting many companies and organizations that needed the safe place after the crackdown in October, and many IT companies that were repressed after October 26, the ultimatum and national strike. They found the place to work in different cities of Ukraine. Some of them moved later to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. So this on this emergency support, it's fantastic. We also see on European Union level, we see that the biggest advocates for Belarus, of course, are our neighbors, but also Scandinavia, Nordic countries. I don't remember such support from Nordic countries, including those EU members, and not only. I never remember in a history. And this support from the very first days that Sviatlana came to Vilnius, for example, the first meetings, from what I remember, were with ministers and representatives of different ministries of Baltic states, but also Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, which was extraordinary. Also, Nordic countries were first who provided technical assistance to Belarus, civil society, media, and families of repressed. At this point, we see the huge help on the human rights issues coming from various European countries, but always, it will always be not enough. The situation in Belarus we are dealing with perhaps can be called as the largest repressions for half century in Eastern Europe. Yes, in Ukraine during Maidan, there was several days when people were shot, of course, but in terms of the scale of repressions and the length of repressions, it's absolutely unprecedented. We are dealing now with more than 33,000 people detained under administrative arrests, fines. We have more than 2,500 criminal cases open This is a new number revealed yesterday by Lukashenko's officials. 2,500 criminal cases open. So we expect that 2,500 people can be jailed can be sentenced to many years of prison. This is extraordinary. We know hundreds companies, organizations that were destroyed, cracked down in the weeks and months after August 9. And of course, statements of support by European countries not enough, definitely here. Traditional technical assistance coming to Belarus is not enough. Media, independent media, needs monthly at least $50 million, not monthly, but yearly, $50 million minimum. But the whole European Union support for media now is about $5 million. They don't have other sources of funding except external funding, unfortunately. And in order to sustain, in order just to provide Belarusians with unbiased alternative information, we need technical assistance. Belarusians need technical assistance. And Lukashenko creates limits. He introduced laws. It's almost impossible to pass any support, equipment, or help to Belarusians in Belarus, and which creates additional complications. So even some countries who want to support, they don't know how to support. And to pass this aid becomes impossible for Belarus. So this is why we need non-conventional solutions. And EU sanctions imposed on Lukashenko's officials are twice milder than sanctions imposed in 2011, when level of repressions was 10 times smaller. Unfortunately, we have hope, of course, that sanctions will be expanded. We hope that Canada, UK, and US will be joining and will be having consolidated position with the EU. But at this point, 6 months after protests, the reaction is very limited. We didn't use even 10% of possibilities that these countries had.
Thank you very much. There is support, I hear, but there is need for more, given the precarious situation. There is one question. I don't know whether any of you can answer it. Would Lithuania and Norway consider making a state party referral of Belarus situation to the International Criminal Court? I have not heard an answer to that question. I don't know whether any one of you will elaborate on it. Maybe the decision has not been taken yet.
Alexander, perhaps you want to update on this, or I can, or I can take it as well. Yeah. If International Criminal Court, and so the question is about this proceedings and instruments of ICC, ECJ, right? Yeah. So unfortunately, Belarus didn't sign, as you know, Rome Statute, and not part of International Criminal Court, and is not able to apply to ECJ because we are not members of Council of Europe. So basically, our instruments are very limited, but European states can submit case and can submit case on Belarus as well, both to ICC and ECJ. So we need the state, the government, and political will of this government to proceed with this. There were a case like Netherlands submitted to ECJ on Syria, if I'm not mistaken. So there are solutions, and we would be happy to contribute to support Belarusian human rights organizations, including Vyasna, would be happy to participate, but we need strong allies who can submit this case, and we need strong advocates for this procedure. We need lawyers who can help in preparing the documentation. Perhaps international investigation under with dignity as one option, or under UN Human Rights Council as another option, could be very helpful as well to strengthen the idea of submitting the case. But we need allies, and we need organizations who will take responsibility. This is also perhaps the limitations, that there are many people, organizations, countries who want to help, but not many who want to take responsibility. And this is why sometimes this after idea, it doesn't move forward.
I can add some words to Franek's speech. Thank you very much, Franek.
Александр, у вас выключен микрофон.
My microphone.
It's on. It's okay now.
Yeah, thank you. It was switched on, but okay. Thank you very much, Franek. I'd like to add that just today we had discussion with representatives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania about this mechanism to how to be used International Criminal Court. But there are more questions than answers so far. Thank you.
If I can just add, and that is that the Norwegian Helsinki Committee at least has kept Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs informed about the efforts to undertake such a state referral, and suggested to them that they consider the same.
Thank you.
If I may?
Yes, please.
Yes. Of course, we will analyze this and evaluate this instrument. I only can say of my side that our parliament will be very supportive. But of course, mechanisms are complicated. We need evidence. We need a lot of things, and perhaps partners. Parliament will not make obstacles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we need both determined politicians and clever lawyers. And then we can manage to do this. We are approaching the end of this panel. I just wanted to challenge Berit to say a few words about the need and how states can participate in covering the need for protection of those frontline defenders who are the victims of the ongoing repression.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, I mean, the obvious highway is to give asylum to those who seek asylum. Now we are also looking into another option, because we realize a lot of the activists do not want to leave Belarus permanently. They just want to have a temporary refuge to avoid the most severe repercussions from the government, and be able to return as soon as it is possible. So we have also started communications with two cities in Norway to open up for the possibility of shelter cities, where the municipalities can fund a temporary stay for activists and their families for a period only. And this has been done in some other European countries. We have it for poets already in Norway, and I think this is something that can be explored as an addition to the sort of final leaving country as an asylum application and as a permanent asylum would be.
Thank you very much, and I thank all of the members of the panel for your viewpoints and for your appeals. We cannot solve the problems in this event, but we can point to the solutions, and I think we have pointed to some of the most important solutions at this time. So thank you very much, and we will now shift to the second panel, which will deal with the situation in the big neighbor country of Belarus, Russia, where we have ongoing repressive campaign going on, linked to some specific cases. But if you look at the broader picture, Russia became more and more repressive during the last 2 decades, during Putin's reign. With us today to discuss measures that can work to counter repression and impunity for repression and impunity for very grave abuses, including killings, poisonings, imprisonments, torture, etc., etc. We have a very prominent panel. We have Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, which is chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, which has a background as journalist, historian, and opposition politician. He survived 2 attempts at poisoning him, a crime which has now been investigated and likely sold by Bellingcat. It was the FSB who tried to kill him in 2015 and 2017. Vladimir is also well known within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. He has, among other things, taken the initiative, the successful initiative to have an investigation of the murder of Boris Nemtsov. And if I'm not wrong, the conclusion of that investigation was presented last year at the Assembly. And then we have Vladimir Ashurkov, executive manager of the Anti-Corruption Foundation. He has a background in banking and politics, although I understand that he started out studying at the Moscow University of Physics and Technology. Together with Alexei Navalny and his colleagues in the Anti-Corruption Foundation, he plays an important role in exposing grand corruption among elites in Russia and elsewhere, and also to expose how Western financial institutions and property markets are abused by corrupt oligarchs to launder their ill-gotten money. And last but not least, we have Bill Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, with us. He has, since the killing of Sergei Magnitsky on 16th November 2009, led one of the most effective global human rights campaigns ever. It's thanks to this campaign that the US, Canada, several European countries, the EU, and maybe soon Australia and Japan have adopted Magnitsky sanctions as a tool to fight impunity for gross violations of human rights, and for some of the jurisdictions also to fight grand corruption. Maybe his background as a businessman in Russia and other former communist countries learned him not to take no for an answer and never give up to fight a good struggle. So I give the virtual floor now to Vladimir, and then we will hear the others afterwards. And as with the previous panel, you can pose questions as we go along. Please, Vladimir.
Gunnar, thank you so much. Greetings from Moscow. It's wonderful to join distinguished colleagues virtually, and I want to first of all thank the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, the Lithuanian permanent representation to the OSCE, and the Lithuanian delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for hosting this virtual conversation. And I hope that before too long we'll be able to resume these in-person events that are so important, that focusing attention on issues that are actually central to the mission of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, because as we know, one of the most fundamental principles of the OSCE laid out in a document that was actually signed here in Moscow in October of 1991, establishes that issues relating to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and fundamental freedoms cannot be considered internal affairs of this or that country, but instead are issues of direct and legitimate concern to other OSCE participating states. And so it is on this premise that we are having this conversation today, that human rights are not an internal matter and are in fact subject to international obligations. Our subject here today is impunity. Impunity for repression, impunity for state-sponsored crimes and attacks. And frankly, I don't know where to start, even if we just look at the past few days and this current week. This past Saturday, the Moscow City Court has officially confirmed the 2.5-year prison sentence for Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny over the case that has already been dismissed by the European Court of Human Rights as arbitrary and politically motivated. The Russian government is simply ignoring these rulings, ignoring these decisions, and to make the matter even more Kafkaesque, the actual formal pretext for transforming Alexei's conditional sentence to a real prison term was the fact that he did not come to register with his parole officer in the last few months of 2020. Of course, the reason he didn't come to register is because he was in Germany recovering from a near fatal poisoning that was orchestrated by the Russian Federal Security Service. So you really cannot make this stuff up. And now on this pretext, he's being, it looks like in the next few days, transferred to one of the penal colonies in the central federal region of Russia. In the last few days, my lawyer, Vadim Prokhorov, and I went to the Russian Investigative Committee here in Moscow to officially file criminal charges against the 4 officers of the FSB who were identified by the Bellingcat investigation that Gunnar has referred to. The FSB officers who are behind 2 poisonings, 2 attacks on my life in 2015 and 2017. Of course, the previous 2 times we did not even receive a response from the Russian authorities. But now there are specific names which we have submitted to them. Of course, we are not under no illusions as to what the response will be. And we realize that we will have to seek justice through the courts all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, because we're talking about the most important right guaranteed under the European Convention, that is Article 2, the right to life. And then, of course, in the next 2 days, this coming Saturday, the 27th of February, we are coming up to the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, the most brazen, the most high-profile political murder in the modern history of Russia, when the opposition leader was gunned down 200 meters from the Kremlin wall. And to this day, the organizers and masterminds of his assassination have not been identified, have not been brought to justice, and continue to remain fully shielded and fully protected from the highest levels of the Russian state. Gunnar mentioned the event we had exactly this time last year in February of 2020, when all of us were, or at least Gunnar and I were in Vienna for the launch of the OSCE report into the Nemtsov case. And here is where we come directly to the topic of our conversation today: how to counter that impunity that these abusers and murderers and scoundrels enjoy here at home in Russia. And that way, of course, is international oversight. And we are deeply grateful to the OSCE, its Parliamentary Assembly, and its rapporteur on the Nemtsov case, Margareta Cederfelt of Sweden, who presented that report last year, for engaging in this work, for producing what is, to this day, the most comprehensive, the most detailed, the most important international legal document on the Nemtsov case. Contains very clear witness testimony as to where, when, and how Vladimir Putin gave the order for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Of course, witness testimony that was simply ignored by Russian investigators. And it comes to a very clear conclusion that the reason for this continuing impunity of the organizers and masterminds of the Nemtsov assassination is not the lack of professionalism by Russian law enforcement agencies, but the lack of political will by the Russian government. That is profoundly important, that the OSCE has come up with this document and has come to this conclusion. Nothing can replace a genuine national investigation. No oversight can. And I not just hope, but I know that one day all of these people, all the way down from the lowest organizers to the highest mastermind, will face justice under the law here in Russia for what they have done. I have no doubt this day will come. But until that day, we're deeply grateful to the OSCE for not allowing the Russian authorities to pretend that everything is okay and that nothing has happened. And it's very important for us to have this international oversight. And so this is where I begin. This is the most, in terms of the legal issues, this is the most important way to counter this impunity: to go to those international institutions, to those rules-based organizations that our country is a member of, both the Council of Europe and the OSCE primarily, to have this accountability that for now is impossible here in Russia. And by the way, I hope and I expect that this coming July, at the annual session of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in Bucharest, the conclusions of the Cederfelt report on the Nemtsov case will be transformed into an actual official resolution that will be passed by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and will have legal force. One other issue where OSCE oversight is extremely important is the issue of political prisoners. Of course, Alexei Navalny is now the most prominent of them, but there are hundreds of others. I just checked the number before logging on. The latest figures as of today from the Memorial Human Rights Center, which is the leading, the most respected human rights organization in Russia, is that we have 373 political prisoners in the Russian Federation in accordance with the criteria established by the Council of Europe and endorsed by the OSCE itself. There are now internationally recognized criteria for a political prisoner. And according to those criteria, very strict, I may add, very conservative, very even restrictive from the point of view of many people. So that really is a gold standard. According to those OSCE and Council of Europe criteria, 373 people are in prisons and penal colonies here in Russia today, not because they have committed any kind of crime, but because they have crossed the path of the regime of Vladimir Putin. Alexei Navalny is now the most prominent of them. The longest serving of them is Alexei Pichugin, the last remaining prisoner of the Yukos case, who's now been in prison for a mind-boggling 18 years since the summer of 2003, in violation of 2 direct rulings by the European Court of Human Rights that his trial had been unfair, in violation of 3 different resolutions by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Again, here we see the Russian authorities flagrantly violating our obligations as a Council of Europe member state. Here is where the OSCE can be really important as well. This time last year, in February 2020 in Vienna, we held an event that was also co-hosted by the Norwegian Helsinki Committee and the Lithuanian Permanent Mission and Delegation to the OSCE on how to discuss how the OSCE can institutionally engage in oversight over the issue of political prisoners, because that is, of course, an issue that directly contradicts the basic principles established in the OSCE documents, including most prominently Article 23 of the OSCE Vienna concluding document that directly prohibits arbitrary and politically motivated detentions. And we know this problem exists not only in Russia, but in several OSCE member states. Also, of course, prominently Belarus, the subject of the first panel today, but also Turkey, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and several others. So I believe that the best way to address this issue is in a comprehensive way. So not focusing perhaps on any specific country, but to establish an institutional way of providing oversight within the OSCE, within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, to directly address the issue of OSCE participating states violating their commitments not to put people in prison, not to prosecute people for arbitrary and politically motivated reasons. And I hope, once again, that when we are able to get back to in-person meetings, both for the Assembly itself, but also for these side events and side discussions, we will be able to resume talking about this issue, sort of pick up where we left off this time last year, and move forward towards an appointment of a rapporteur, for example, at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to address specifically the issue of political prisoners in OSCE participating states. There is now, by the way, a special rapporteur on political prisoners in Russia at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Suna Eversdottir from Iceland, one of her most prominent statements recently was to recognize Alexei Navalny as a political prisoner as soon as he was arrested upon his return here in Moscow. I think it's very important to, and she's currently working on her report at the Council of Europe on the issue of political prisoners in Russia. I think it would be really important to do the same work at the OSCE. I want to say a couple of words on the interrelationship between Russia and Belarus. I'm grateful to the organizers for sort of putting those 2 panels together, because of course, we are the last 2 dictatorships in Europe, Russia and Belarus, Lukashenko and Putin, the last 2 dictators in Europe. And many of the processes, many of the things that happen in our countries are very interconnected. And for example, a lot of people expect what we saw in Belarus last year in 2020, a patently fraudulent election, and then mass protests all over the country, to be repeated here in Russia in 2024, when we have our own quote-unquote presidential election next time. So it's really important for us in Russia also that the international community steps in now to provide meaningful oversight and accountability for those human rights abuses in Belarus, including specifically to follow the recommendation that was that was included in last year's OSCE Moscow Mechanism report on Belarus for establishing an international investigative mechanism to provide accountability for those grave human rights abuses that Lukashenko has unleashed, and to do so in cooperation with other international institutions. And it's really important that there is currently a special rapporteur on human rights abuses in Belarus at the Council of Europe. Even though Belarus is not a member state, it's still an applicant state formally. And so I believe one of the sort of areas of focus for the Council of Europe rapporteur on human rights abuses in Belarus, Alexandre Louis of France, will be also to work towards that joint investigative mechanism to address those human rights abuses unleashed by Lukashenko's regime. And hopefully this can be done together by the OSCE, by the Council of Europe, also perhaps by the European Parliament. One other issue that directly concerns OSCE is questions of legitimacy and democracy and obligations when it comes to electoral standards. As you know, last year, under the cover of the pandemic, Vladimir Putin held a sham plebiscite that allowed him personally to waive presidential term limits and to stay on in the Kremlin beyond the end of his current and final mandate in the spring of 2024. Those constitutional amendments were fraudulent. Those constitutional amendments were enacted illegally. Those constitutional amendments are null and void. That, in fact, is a very clear conclusion that was reached in a recently adopted European Parliament resolution. This was resolution 2020-2777 RSP that very clearly stated that those constitutional amendments were enacted illegally. This was also a conclusion reached by many leaders of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, including Mikhail Link, who used to head the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions of Human Rights, including the co-leaders of the US delegation, Senator Wicker and Congressman Hastings, including the chairman of the US Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch, who made a statement that these changes were enacted in an illegitimate fashion because they violated on so many levels, not only Russian legislation, both on how to effect constitutional amendments and also on how to conduct elections or referenda, but also, very importantly for this conversation, Russia's obligations under the OSCE. The OSCE Copenhagen document clearly states, clearly puts forward the standards for electoral procedures, including the right to campaign freely, including transparency in the vote count, including the invitation for OSCE observers. None of this happened in this sham plebiscite last year. This was a total farce, even by the very low standards of elections in Putin's Russia. And it's very important that the OSCE also takes a stand on this and makes it very clear that Vladimir Putin's final legitimate constitutional mandate, I mean, we can even debate as to how legitimate this is now. I certainly have my views on this, but it is undoubtful, and it is without argument that after May of 2024, if Putin decides to remain in power, this will be an illegitimate usurpation. And I think it is very important that the OSCE takes a position on this. Very finally, in terms of the practical steps for countering impunity, there is one most important and most effective step, and that is, of course, the Magnitsky sanctions in the form of visa bans and asset freezes against those officials, not only in the Putin regime, not only the Lukashenko regime, but in any authoritarian abusive regime around the world. People who are personally complicit in corruption and human rights abuses in their own countries should not be afforded the privilege of traveling to, owning assets in, or using the financial and banking systems of Western democratic nations that pride themselves on their domestic adherence to democracy and the rule of law, and yet very often open their doors to those people who flagrantly violate those very norms in their own countries. This is double standard. This is hypocrisy. This is enabling. This should stop. It's very important earlier this week to hear that the European Union will be going forward with targeted sanctions against senior Putin regime officials in response to the unlawful arrest of Alexei Navalny. This should be continued. This should be expanded, and I look forward to working together with Bill and Vladimir and many other colleagues to, first of all, to taking this Magnitsky legislation to other jurisdictions across the democratic world, and also to make sure that they are implemented properly in those countries where they do exist now. And you know, we're not going to rest until the day when every single democratic country sends a very clear message that the crooks, the murderers, the human rights abusers will no longer be welcome, either on their soil or in our banking and financial systems. Thank you so much, Gunnar, once again for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing from friends and colleagues on the panel.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. A lot of clear messages and recommendations for action. And now we'll give the virtual floor to Vladimir Ashurkov. I remember that Alexei Navalny welcomed the sanctions from the EU, but he added that they should target those super rich oligarchs who are maybe the most important players in the current system. Please, Vladimir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I will make my statement short. I think the crimes and the violations of human rights by Russian state and its actors have been well established. the main thing is what the international community and EU and Western countries can do about it. And there is really no silver bullet that the West can use to influence the behavior of Russian authorities. If there was such a silver bullet, it probably would have been used already. There is also no silver bullet for the democratic opposition in Russia that myself and Vladimir Kara-Murza represent. We are trying to do our best. In terms of specific measures that European countries can think about, we started our discussion, our panel with the part on Belarus. And Belarus is currently the most clear-cut frontier in the world, at least in Europe, where the fight between good and evil takes place. And if the democratic forces in Belarus prevail, this will be a very good thing in itself, but it also will influence the situation in Russia very much. An example of Belarus entering the path towards political reform, towards democratic freedoms, towards civil freedoms would be a very important message and a very important encouragement for Russians fighting for freedom in Russia. Second, you mentioned sanctions, and Alexei Navalny and our team have for years advocated individual sanctions against perpetrators of corruption and human rights abuse in Russia. We have worked with Alexei on a list of most prominent people who are involved in corruption and human rights abuse with a view to proposing it to Western countries for sanctioning. After Alexei was unlawfully detained upon his return to Russia, I made this list public. It includes 35 names, and I sent it to the US administration, to the UK government, and to European Union. The letter is going through the motions in different countries. I follow the process in the US, the UK. The EU has been the most speedy with its response. We've heard about the sanctions, which use Magnitsky legislation just adopted in the EU last December. It's a first attempt at using this legislation. Unfortunately, the sanctions were applied just to 4 people within the security apparatus of Russia. These sanctions are a good sort of initial step, but sanctions like this have historically been less effective because people who work in Russian security services, they don't have assets in the West, they don't usually travel there. So for them, sanctions are not as hurtful than for people who are enjoying their ill-gotten gains in the West that travel to the West and have assets there. And our list included a few of these so-called oligarchs who are now very close to Putin and who are part of his influence networks in the West. And it's often said that you need a clear sort of link between the people who are sanctioned to particular crimes. This is an illusion. Sanctions are inherently a political instrument. It's not a judicial instrument. They cannot be appealed. They cannot be brought to a court of law. What we are, the message that we would like the Western governments to send to these people is not you're criminals, you're bad people, we throw you in jail. It's rather, we suspect that you are involved in corruption and human rights abuse. The right forum for investigation of this crime is Russia. Unfortunately, it's not possible now in Russia, and you have played a part in that. So please stay away from our countries. Don't try to stick your dubious money into our financial system, into our assets, etc., etc. I think this this will be a very effective mechanism if the EU and other Western countries adopt it. Next issue is humanitarian issues, support for people who are fighting for freedom in Russia and Belarus and who are illegally persecuted by the authorities. One example of such support that I can quote is the following. Over the last 2 months, after the mass protests in Russia, there have been a number of cases where young people, students, have been expelled from their universities for peaceful protesting, for totally legitimate activities. And if the EU or international organization can establish some sort of support network that would allow them to continue education in Europe, I think that would be very helpful. It's just one example of humanitarian issues, and there are, of course, many others, other measures of support. Last thing is, one of the topics of today is international organizations. And just 2 days ago, Amnesty International, a very reputable and vast and historic international organization, has reversed its decision on recognizing Alexei Navalny as prisoner of conscience. We believe, and it's widely supported by evidence, that this was as a result of disinformation and manipulation on behalf of Russian state media, Russian state propaganda. We believe that a genuine mistake has been made in this case, and we intend to work with Amnesty International to persuade them to try to reverse this decision. That's all for me, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Time is running, and I'm very pleased to give the virtual floor to Bill Browder to have your assessment of how well are the EU start on the human rights Magnitsky sanctions in your view, selecting people from the security apparatus rather than the people with the money.
Gunnar, thank you for organizing this. And let me just, before I start, say something about our hosts. The Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and Gunnar in particular, has been working with me arm in arm for a decade to create the Magnitsky Act around the world. And among my colleagues, he's probably the most stalwart, fearless, and wonderful, and he should be recognized. And I'd also like to recognize the Lithuanian Parliament and with Lithuanian government. Long before the EU ever had a Magnitsky Act, on the anniversary of Sergei's murder, the 8th anniversary in 2017, the Lithuanian Parliament voted unanimously for a Lithuanian Magnitsky Act, knowing full well that it was going to upset their large and aggressive neighbor, but they didn't blink. They did it, and I think it was a very it was a message that shamed the European Union, that if a little country like Lithuania could do it, why couldn't the EU do it? And then the EU finally followed up 3 years later. And so I'm honored and pleased to be on this call with these two important partners in our Magnitsky campaign. As everybody on this call probably knows, Russia is a kleptocracy. Putin is the mafia boss of this kleptocracy. The driving principle of the kleptocracy is for Putin and about 1,000 people around him to benefit themselves with enormous riches beyond anyone's beyond anyone's needs by 1,000 or 1,000,000 times at the expense of the average person in Russia. That kleptocracy has bled dry the country in every possible way, and people in Russia are mad. And Alexei Navalny is the incarnation of that anger. He's the one who's been able to articulate it and express it best. And as a result, many, many people around Russia support him and support his mission, which is to stop this kleptocratic regime from ruining the country. Now, as bad as the kleptocracy is in terms of its effect, in terms of stopping it and in terms of affecting it, it has one huge fundamental weakness, which is that the kleptocrats all want to steal their money, commit their crimes, murder their victims in Russia, and they want to have the absolute safety and security of knowing that the money that they stole is not going to be taken away from them. And that's the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. And when we were fighting for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and the Russian and the Putin regime was doing everything possible to stop us and to persecute his family and to cover up his murder and to badmouth him and say all sorts of terrible things, the one thing that they didn't bargain on was that we would eventually be able to get countries around the world to pass Magnitsky Acts and to apply Magnitsky Acts in his case and other cases. And all of a sudden, that this smug comfort that Putin and his top cronies had of being able to like do all this terrible stuff and enjoy impunity all came crumbling down because their assets are no longer safe in the West. This is the fundamental valuable tool that we can use in the West. As Vladimir says, or both Vladimirs have said, it's not, in the West, it's not really our place to implement regime change. That's for the Russians. But as Westerners, it is our place to support those Russians by not enabling this horrible kleptocracy to exist and to keep their money safe in the West. So we now have the Magnitsky Act in most relevant countries. The Magnitsky Act exists in the United States, it exists in Canada and the UK, and as of a few months ago, we now have it in the EU. It took a long time for the EU to do it, but we now have it in the EU. And we now have probably one of the biggest challenges that we've ever seen, which is the Navalny case. I mean, this is so stark. Putin tried to kill him and didn't get away with it. Tried to keep him in exile and didn't get away with it. Put him in jail in Russia when it was in a court that Russia is a part of, the European Court for Human Rights, said to release him, didn't release him. And so the most strenuous, serious sanctions need to be imposed on Putin and those around him. So the EU has announced, or I should say that they've listed 4 names, and they're not bad names. They're real people. They're not that. Normally the EU, when they get involved in sanctioning, they want to look like they're doing something, and so they effectively pick some names out of the telephone directory, say, look how great we've been, and then can go back to winking at Foreign Minister Lavrov. These are real names, 4 names, but it's a very short list. A lot more people are involved. And as Vladimir Oshakov has said, and Vladimir Kara-Murza has said, it needs to go much further than functionaries. The functionaries, by design, don't keep money in their own name. They keep money in the names of other people, as Putin does. So where is Putin's money and where is the functionaries' money really? It's in the name of these enablers, these Russian enablers, their cashiers. And at the moment, the EU doesn't have the ability to sanction Putin's cashiers. In order to do Magnitsky sanctions properly, it needs to apply to human rights abusers and it needs to apply to corruption. When the EU was putting together their Magnitsky Act, they said, we can't do corruption. Why can't they do corruption? Because it requires unanimity to do the Magnitsky Act, and Hungary and other Putin friends basically vetoed corruption. So we have a dual task here. One is to make sure that corruption is included as part of the EU Magnitsky Act. And then once it is included, to make sure that the EU Magnitsky Act applies towards the 35 names that Alexei Navalny and his team and Vladimir have put out there of the cashiers of the Putin regime. Alexei Navalny supported us very much in our campaign for Magnitsky sanctions. He helped us exposing the people involved in the Magnitsky campaign at great personal cost. And I think it's all of our duties now that we have a Magnitsky Act to make sure that it applies overwhelmingly against the Putin regime, so that these people sit up and wake up and understand that if anything were ever to happen to Alexei in custody, their lives are completely and absolutely over financially in the West.
Thank you very much. I think you all spoke very clearly, so I don't have a lot of questions. Maybe I'll finish this panel with asking you the following. There was a report launched recently by the Atlantic Council, Russia after Putin. And in that context, it was debated that one of the mistakes which were done in the 1990s was not to dismantle the KGB, to say that all the crimes of the past, we have to look to the future and maybe try to forget what happened before. As we are now in a very special situation with Russia, with its cases and with this increasing repression, what will be your main advice to create a better Russia, the next Russia, in terms of reacting to all the crimes that we have seen during the last 2 decades? Let's start with Vladimir.
Okay, thank you, Gunnar. Well, I think the absolutely fundamental issue here is the issue of accountability. I think the biggest mistake of the democratic reformers around President Boris Yeltsin back in the early 1990s was exactly what you just said, the inability or the unwillingness to fully break with the past, to fully open up the old archives, to have some accountability for the crimes of the former regime. All of those things that were done in many other countries of Eastern and Central Europe, but were not done in Russia. There were some sort of timid attempts in that direction, but they were very quickly stopped. And the archives, for the most part, remain closed. The people who are direct participants in these state-sponsored crimes in the Soviet time, including state-sponsored crimes against our own citizens, were left alone. There was no public official condemnation of the previous regime. And, you know, the point about this is that it's not about the past, it's about the future. You cannot move on, really, and really turn the page and really start anew unless you are holding accountable those people who are responsible for those crimes before. And this was the biggest mistake of the 1990s. And there were far-sighted people at the time, people like Vladimir Bukovsky and Galina Starovoytova, who said that we need to do this, that we need some kind of illustration procedure where the people who are directly responsible for these crimes would no longer be able, for example, to hold position of power, including officers of the Soviet KGB, because that is the most criminal organization of all. And so all that was done was that the monument to the founder of the KGB, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was spectacularly removed in August of 1991. Those are probably the most enduring images of the Russian Democratic Revolution. You know, the statue of the KGB founder hanging from a noose as a crane is lifting it from its pedestal. By the way, in the next few weeks, this monument is very likely going to come back. That's one of the most discussed issues here in Moscow this week, the decision to, there's now a sort of another sham online vote being held, and very few people doubt that Dzerzhinsky will soon be back as this most potent symbol of a return to the old. But the problem was that people stopped at the monument, and the whole system should have been dismantled. The perpetrators of its crimes should have been held accountable. The whole regime should have been condemned, and to make sure that nothing like this can happen again. Just as it is unthinkable today in Germany, for example, to have a return either to Nazism or to East German communism, We should have done the same thing, and we didn't. People said, we don't need a witch hunt. And people like Bukovsky said, well, if we don't do this, then the witches are going to come back and they're going to hunt us. And that is, of course, exactly what had happened after Putin, a former Soviet KGB officer, came to power. So that's the main thing that we will need to address the next time we have a window of opportunity for democratic change here in Russia, which will happen. There is no question about it. The only question is when. And the main issue, the most fundamental issue, is to go forward with this transitional justice, as so many other post-authoritarian countries from South Africa to Chile to South Korea to former Yugoslavia went through, to hold those people accountable, the people who are perpetrating these state-sponsored crimes that we are discussing today, and to make sure that we really do turn the page and that we will never ever come back again to the horror that we're living in today.
Thank you, Vladimir. Would also the other Vladimir Arshurko want to comment on this question?
Sure, I would like to echo Vladimir Karamurza's comments that it's very important to have accountability, and there are a number of measures like lustration that are in all our political programs, and we have the goal of restoring the rule of law in Russia, restoring the natural feedback mechanism between the state and the society, independent judiciary, fair law enforcement system, representative political system. We would like all criminals to be accountable for their crimes and for the repression of human rights over the last 20 years. However, I think it would be naive now to put ourselves into any concrete measures and concrete legislation to that extent from the place where we are as the democratic opposition and as Putin regime. We don't know the scenario of how the political change in Russia will unfold. We don't know its speed, its conditions. More importantly than saying that every criminal and corrupt person will be punished, I think it will be more important to look into the future and the exact things, the exact measures will be decided at that time. It's not really possible to predict them, but for sure, our overriding goal is restoring the rule of law and restoring the civil and political freedoms in Russia.
Thank you very much. Bill, you will got the final word on this panel, please.
So it's really Russia's an odd place. The most talented people in Russia don't want to go and start businesses or invent new products. They want to get jobs at the KGB, or they want to enter the KGB and Interior Ministry academies. Why do they want to do that? Because those are the most rewarding careers in Russia. Why are they the most rewarding careers in Russia? Because the people who have the power to imprison and take hostage the economic players in Russia are the ones who can then extort the economic benefits for those businesses. And so Russia is going to always be a terrible place where the economy doesn't accrue to the benefit of the people in the economy, as long as this system of KGB police state exists. And that's going to require a really radical transformation in order to make a society that doesn't reward that type of behavior. And it's really interesting if you look at other countries. So everybody, arrest seems to be the way in which like post-Soviet countries work. In Georgia, they just go and arrest the leader of the opposition, the new prime minister, this kind of stuff just goes on everywhere, and it really I hope that when the two Vladimirs are in government in a post-Putin Russia, that the first thing they'll do is fully and absolutely dismantle this police state, economic rent-seeking thing that really ruins it for everybody in the whole country.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all three of you for speaking so clear and so consistently on the challenge of fighting impunity and pointing to the remedies that exists and which has to be used effectively. To end this event, we have invited a Norwegian parliamentarian, a member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So please, Åsmund Aukrust, the virtual floor is yours.
I think you need to say that once more, you know.
So I will ask Åsmund Aukrust to take the virtual floor and come up with some concluding remarks, which is not an easy thing after all these interventions. But please.
Okay, thank you so much. I will be very brief because we are already over time and the plenary session has already started. But I would just like to thank the Norwegian Helsinki Committee for arranging this very informative and interesting side event. I think all of us miss to see each other and to be together in person, and I wish we all could be in Vienna today. However, we have now learned to use these digital tools, which I think will be very helpful for us also in the future, because it gets a new way to get information also when we are not meeting in physics. And then we can use these tools to discuss the issues of importance of democracy and human rights. These issues are more important today than 1 year ago. Because of the pandemic, it doesn't get the attention on the agenda that it deserves. But also because of the pandemic, we have seen that many countries has moved in the wrong direction the last year. So therefore, I think it's been so grateful. I'm so grateful that we could have this conversation here today. And I would say to our friends from Belarus that the most impressive thing the last year in this very special 2020 has been to see the democratic movement in Belarus. It's touched a whole world when we saw the pictures from the people out on the streets in Minsk in the fight for democracy. And I'm glad to hear that you felt our support and that you felt especially the support from your neighbors and from the Nordic countries. And we promise to be with you also in the years to come, also when you're not the headline of the news anymore. So we stay by the demand from Madame Sviatlana when she said they demanded fair elections and the freedom of political prisoners. Of course, as we all know, there is a very clear link between what's happening in Belarus and what's happening in Russia, and therefore I think it was so fruitful to have these discussions combined. And I would just like to say to our Russian friends that we are so impressed of their courage and their that they are willing to tell their story and to tell what's happening in Russia today. From our Norwegian perspective, Russia is our neighbor, and we have a good relationship with our Russian neighbor, which we all want to have. We want to have a good neighborship where we work together on common issues. However, to be a good neighbor is also to be an honest neighbor, and to tell the truth of what actually is happening. I think we should raise on a higher to a higher agenda the issue of political prisoners. We know a few of them very well, and I'm glad to see that in the trial that was in January, many international observers were present, including some from the Norwegian embassy. But as you said, that's only one of very many issues, and a number of over 300 or almost 400 is a very high number. And of course, we demand their justice. And I think it was a great idea what was raised to have a political rapporteur on political prisoners in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Because our assembly, we can play an important role. We are a unique place for politicians from so many countries to meet. We are a place for dialogue, and we are a place for policy making, both within the assembly, but also to bring back the stories, the information from the assembly back to our home countries and to make it national policy. Let me just end by saying that it's important to meet as politicians. However, as politicians, we often not get the full picture, and therefore it's so important to have civil society actors. The civil society, they play a key role in the in a democracy. And I would like to thank the Norwegian Helsinki Committee for being one of the most important civil society organizations for human rights and democracy. And through them and other organizations, we get more information on what's actually happening on the grassroots. We get their contact with human rights defenders, which we would never have met if it hadn't been for the civil society. So once again, just thank you so much for this side event. I look forward to meet in person, hopefully next year in Vienna or maybe before. And nevertheless, we should continue to have more frequent meetings through Skype or Zoom or on all the others dialogue channels. So let me just conclude by what Madam Sviatlana said. She said, let's work together and let's stay together, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So thank you so much again.
Thanks a lot, Åsmund. And that concludes this event. Thank you, all of you who took part. It has been a great 1 hour and 45 minutes. Thank you. And bye-bye. Stay safe.